little cell, let's say, through which we move through the world. Lots of our work is very site sensitive. Usually we are invited somewhere to explore and to propose our ideas in relation to a very specific situation or site. So on one of these explorations, we bumped into the living newspaper as a form, as a practice. And we will tell you a little bit about the background of how we bumped into that, because we were invited by SF MoMA and the San Francisco Public Libraries in San Francisco to develop a project which was under the umbrella of public knowledge. So it was a project that was focusing on how public knowledge was evolving during the recent, I would say, pressure on civicness and civic participation and the access to knowledge and information that comes with it. So on the one hand, the increasing impact of Silicon Valley and social media on all of our lives worldwide, I would say. And on the other hand, let's say the pocketing and fragmentation of the different types and dynamics of information that also separates people in a large way, I would say. So when we were usually we are invited carte blanche. So when we came to San Francisco and sort of dived into this, still not knowing what we wanted to do, or how we could approach this, because we knew that we wanted to tackle this idea of information and public space. We were talking with an architect historian who was talking about the New Deal period of Roosevelt as the only socialist moment. Well, New Deal is very much in the news, I would say, today, in the form of New Green Deal, Green New Deal, New Bauhaus Deal, European New Deal, you name it. It's like very much back on the agenda, I would say. And those 3 years ago, when we talked with the architect historian, Gray Bracken, he mentioned this as the only socialist moment in the history of the United States. And he pointed out an object to us, which is a scale model of the city of San Francisco of 15 by 15 meters. And it's part of the WPA/New Deal project of Roosevelt, where they let's say during the crisis, they sort of generated, I would say, put people to work, but that sounds very unnice, I would say. But, you know, they created, let's say, work programs for people to be able to continue to work while this crisis was going on. So under the flag of the WPA projects was, for example, large dam projects, infrastructural projects, dikes, but I would say mostly dams, but also artistic projects and art programs and theater programs, etc., etc. And also, if you think of the murals that have been done by, for example, Diego Rivera, also those were part of these WPA projects, specifically in San Francisco. So we were thinking of how finding this scale model and pulling it out of the warehouses of Berkeley as I would say a platform to talk about the dynamics of citizenship and what it means to have a voice or to gain a voice in a city that is, like, let's say, largely under pressure of losing voice, I would say. We were thinking, how can we sort of activate this vehicle, this platform, this object of the scale model? How can we use that as a discussion piece? And then we were diving into different ways of participatory practices. We had, for example, Anna and Lawrence Halprin, architect and dancer, were very influential and very inspirational, but also we bumped into this living newspaper. We eventually dropped it, but because it didn't fit, let's say, to the purpose of the project that we were developing, but we kept it always in the back of our mind as a very interesting way of reenacting, let's say, reality in different ways. And so when we started talking with Cicely and Lucy, we thought this would be something that would be really interesting to develop with a group of people as a preparation to the summer school in what is it, August, I think, yeah. So there we are. Jos.
Yeah, maybe it's to add some information also because of the model, the scale model was, it was divided over the 29 libraries in San Francisco itself. So each neighborhood had their own neighborhood. And the main course of this whole project was to bring the whole model back together, 15 by 16 meters. And the problem in San Francisco, there is no space. There is space, but it's always occupied by big companies for conferences. So one of the subtitles was also, is there space for San Francisco in San Francisco? So meaning, is there space for this model to be displayed in its whole entity. Yeah. And then last March, actually, the plan was to bring the model together because we found a space in the City College in San Francisco, which was big enough, but because of COVID, the whole project didn't happen. And then also the idea was then to work out the script of these interviews of all these people we were talking to of the year before and all these meetings, to do some sort of reenactment based on the living newspapers. In that sense, there was still this idea, but due to this COVID crisis, it couldn't happen. So the whole project is stopped now, I think. I don't think the model will come back together, but yeah, that's the reality in that sense. So there's still no space for San Francisco in San Francisco, you could argue.
No.
But
No, I think we give it back to Cicely now, no? So you can introduce Rania.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Lisbeth and Jos. So I'll now briefly thank you, Rania, Dr. Rania Karoula, for coming and contributing today. So a very short introduction. We invited Rania Karoula after finding her research around specifically the Federal Theatre Project and her research on the living newspaper. So in January 2021, Karoula published the book, The Federal Theatre Project 1935 to 39, Engagement and Experimentation, which was published with Edinburgh University Press. And we invited Rania today specifically to give a bit of an introduction to the history and context of the living newspaper. So I'm just going to allow Rania to share her screen, and then we can begin.
Is everybody seeing this? Yes? Okay, excellent. So hello, and thank you, Cicely, for the introduction. Thank you for your kind words. I'm gonna start straight away. There is a lot to cover, so apologies in advance for talking too fast or zooming through some of those slides, but I think you have the PDF, or Cicely might send the PDF of the points and quotes I'm using, and anything we can revisit in the Q&A session. And apologies for my creaking chair. Okay. I entitled this talk, The Living Newspaper Made in America, with a question mark, and hopefully that will make sense by the end of this presentation. So before we talk about the living newspaper per se, Lisbeth and yours have already kind of contextualized it, so I'll just briefly mention that. So what was the living newspaper? Was part of the Federal Theatre Project. What was the Federal Theatre Project? It was the FTP, in short, was part of Roosevelt's New Deal plan to alleviate, if you like, the ills of the Great Depression. It involved several cultural programs to rehabilitate professionals influenced by the Depression. In 1935, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was a massive unemployment relief program, was established, and within that you have the Federal Project number 1 that was initiated. The Federal Theatre Project was one of the 5 divisions of the Federal Project number 1. The original aim was to employ, let's call them creatives, artists, actors, set designers, journalists, in jobs in an area of their expertise until the economy recovered. And of all the units, of those 5 units, it was the only one that had a woman as a director, Hallie Flanagan. So Hallie Flanagan had a very clear vision, if you like, of what the Federal Theatre Project could and would be, as well as what it was not, or as what it would not be. So as you can see from those quotes, it is not a relief project in which artificial jobs are dealt out to people of inferior talent, but rather a plan which begins by saying, in rethinking theatre activity in terms of the art and economics of 1935, we need theatre enterprises which will supplement our already existing splendid New York stage. Now, what it was not. It was not a national theatre in the European sense of a group of artists chosen to represent the government. It was never referred to by me as a national theatre, though critics increasingly spoke of it as such. It was rather a federation of theatres. That was the origin and meaning of its name, and the italics are my emphasis, if you like. So through its relief status, the FTP would also acquire a social status, as it would strive, if you like, to represent unrepresented audiences. It would stimulate a social and theatrical response to the play's subject matter. And this was, in my opinion, the first attempt within American cultural life of launching a project which would unite politics with the theater of its time under the auspices of a USA government. Now, before we discuss the Living Newspaper in detail, the American Living Newspaper, it is imperative that I briefly, very briefly, and I'll jump through some of those things, but as I said, you'll have those notes, present to you some of those influences, because that will enable you to draw some parallels in what will follow. So some of you are aware of those. If not, I'm happy to answer any questions later on. So one of those influences was Meyerhold. So we're talking about Russian constructivism and his method of acting, biomechanics. As I said, I won't go into detail, but the main thing was that the stage is dispensed, if you like, of unnecessary decorations and props, and you'll see that in the American Living Newspaper. And very importantly, the actor is no longer an imagined character with psychological depth. The emphasis is on the body, the physicality of the actor. As Meyerhold said, word is but an embroidery on the canvas of movement. Another influence, and very important to me, was the Soviet Blue Blouse Group. Okay, the Soviet Blue Blouse Group was originally formed in Moscow by a group of students at the Institute of Journalism. They were influenced by the tradition of the spoken newspaper, which was prominent because of the huge levels of illiteracy. Now, acknowledging the importance of oral tradition, the influence of constructivism, and the close relation between theater and journalism, they were set up as a living newspaper, a group that would present the news, but at the same time employ both popular and avant-garde techniques, emulating Meyerhold or Mayakovsky, as the quote says. Lastly, and very briefly, Bertolt Brecht, you know, his theory of the epic theater and gestures in acting, but also what was very important was the introduction of film projections, moving platforms, lighting, and all complementing the dramatic text. The emphasis is also, of course, on the physicality and the materiality of the actor's body. Last but not least, it's the American workers' drama of the 1930s, and the most well-known theatrical example that you might also have heard is Clifford Odets' Waiting for Lefty, about taxi drivers unionizing. So, the Living Newspaper, how was it set up in, within the Federal Theatre Project? Now, Hallie Flanagan, along with Elmer Rice, the director of the New York FTP branch, proposed the creation of the Living Newspaper after securing the sponsorship of the Newspaper Guild. So they needed journalists. As the second point says in the quote, the living newspaper originally was set up like a city daily. You had editor-in-chief, you had a managing editor, city editors, reporters, copy readers, everything. They rummaged through, similarly to you, thousands of books, reports, newspapers, magazine, articles, in an attempt, as he says, to create an authoritative dramatic treatment, at once historic and contemporary, of current events. And we'll see that in the examples I will present of actual living newspapers. Now, between 1935 and 1937, and that's quite important, the living newspapers produced were attributed a collective status. Official authorship, as we know, of a dramatic text was not bestowed to a single person, but that changed in 1935. And as you can see, I've listed quite a few, and these are not exhaustive, by the way, but some of the subjects included were housing, electricity, international events, war, racial relationships, social exclusion, trade unionism, which was big, as well as many more. No. So the living newspaper, what was its form? You know, what was its mode of representation? So firstly, or quite importantly, it had what we call the voice of the living newspaper. Now, this was an actor you couldn't see. The voice was projected, you know, and it was quite traumatic for people, for the audience sitting, to suddenly hear that voice. The living newspaper, the voice of the living newspaper, introduced the time, place, and location of the dramatic action, interrupted and commented further on the events staged, addressed the public directly, and presented different perspectives on the issue. The stage was deprived of any ornament that could cause disruption, and the use of ordinary objects acquired a more symbolic significance. And that was necessary, obviously, because we're talking about the Depression. You know, the amount of money that those productions were given were very little. Most of the amount of money that the FTP allocated to either unit was spent on, you know, salary costs. They also used, there was an extensive use of puppetry, visual projections, shadow acting, and crowd scenes. And they also experimented with lighting, and that was quite interesting. So they found ways of using different colors of bulbs to highlight maybe the action or emotions, if you like. They isolated characters on single spots, and they also used blackouts quite frequently. Now, unlike the European examples I discussed before, the American living newspaper abandoned, if you like, a theatrical eclecticism in favor of a more detailed form of investigative theater centralized on one theme. And this is Arendt's quote here, where he says that the living newspaper is the dramatization of a problem composed in greater or lesser extent of many news events, all bearing on the one subject. So the living newspaper staff decided that the emphasis on one subject and its multiple representations would enable them to communicate multiple solutions, and thus, allow the audience to think a specific issue in a variety of circumstances. So that was the rationale behind that. Now, let's look at some actual examples of living newspapers and discuss those. Now, I would really love to show you one of the very, very first living newspapers called Ethiopia. I don't know if any of you have heard or come across it in your research. But the first example of a living newspaper, quite ironically and foreshadowing what is to come, was censored by the government. There was only the preview seen by members of the press, but it was never performed for the audience, and actually led to Elmer Rice's resignation. The history of this performance is intriguing and it's complicated, but its censorship, to me, highlights the bureaucracy and the political intrigues consequent of the living newspaper and the Federal Theatre being a government-sponsored theatre. So I'm going to talk to you about the following living newspaper. AAA plowed it under. Okay, so this was directed by Joseph Losey, and Arthur Arendt, whose quotes I used previously, was the editor-in-chief. And it used 26 highly stylized scenes, and the subject was the presentation of the agricultural depression up until the then recent invalidation of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, thus AAA, okay, by the Supreme Court. Now the characters used, and maybe you can see from some of those three pictures, were used to represent classes rather than individuals as such. The dialogues were short to represent a specific reality and directly address the audience. Now, there was the use of projection, as you can see, lighting, shadows, and let me see if I can get to the next one. The visual documentation of events. You know, you have the stock market, or on your, in my screen, it's on the right, or on your left, you have, you know, the meat, the bread, fruits, vegetables, restaurant, you know, and it would show how the prices go up and how that affects, if you like, the chain, the food chain. So all that were unified organically, if you like, and offered the audience a new theatrical experience. Now, this living newspaper proposed at the end two solutions to the problem. The first one was, the first strategy was legislative. So they said, let's have a new act written though within the Constitution so that it's not exposed to the whims of any Supreme Court at any point. The second, which was more partisan, or if you like, politically explicit, was the creation of a farmer labor party that would protect the rights of workers and farmers. So needless to say, this living newspaper was received warmly, excitedly by the audiences, but not so well by the Congress, not so well by politicians of both spectrums, Democrats or Republicans, members, administrative members of the WPA, and actually members of the press. You know, bypassing those controversies, the next living newspaper was called Injunction Granted. Again directed by Losey, again Arendt was editor-in-chief. Now, Injunction Granted is more editorially selective than AAA Plowed It Under, and it uses 28 scenes, which are a bit longer, and they follow a more historically progressive, if you like, line. The play was a chronological presentation of labor history, from its negligible establishment to its biased treatment by the American courts. It was actually quoting actual courts, actual cases, to the final formation of what they called the CIO, which was the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, the title derives from the phrase that American judges used countlessly when ruling against any group of workers trying to form labor unions. The stage, maybe you can see from this image, but also from here, uses a system of runways and platforms and hatches. And in that way, they were able to use lighting and shadows and puppetry as well. Losey also used placards and projected headlines. And it also used farce and introduced the muted figure of the clown. Let me see if I can go back, which is acted by, if you can see my cursor, by Norman Lloyd. On top of the voice of the living newspaper to further enhance, if you like, the use of satire. Similarly to the AAA Plowed It Under, Injunction Granted advocated a dual solution, a proper social legislation, but also the creation of a union. And similarly to AAA, the play, well, actually not similarly, even worse. It was not well received by politicians, the press, theater critics, and Flanagan herself, who had major reservations because it didn't shy away from attacking real politicians and in a personalized and very satirical manner, but also because Losey had a past association with the Communist Party. So AAA Plowed It Under, in my opinion, was characterized a pink play. This was a red play. Okay, so the audience, however, queued up to see it, bought tickets in advance, and when it was cancelled, they had to be, you know, those tickets had to be refunded. The people couldn't see it, unfortunately. So those two productions took place in 36 and 37. Now, what happens in 1937? The FDP has always been under immense pressure from Congress regarding its funding. So by the end of 37, it suffered a cut of 30% of the New York personnel. Okay, and that had a massive influence on how Flanagan and all the others involved with the Living newspaper, revisited its structure, the themes, its intentions, its representation. So a very interesting shift and change is in terms of the audience. In terms of the audience, there's a more conscious drive to engage and draw in the middle class audience, but that up to that point, if you like, was Broadway's, intended audience. In terms of themes and representation, if you like, the more agitational and direct character of the previous examples that we discussed is rejected. Instead, you have a more sympathetic endorsement of the New York Deal's program's aspirations, which was there, if you like, in the first two, but you'll see in the next two examples I'll discuss how it's more wholly, if you like, embraced. So in terms of changes, what are the changes that happen in terms of the form that the original, as they were originally conceived? So authorship is no longer attributed to the entire unit. This collective identity goes out of the window. In Power and 1/3 of the Nation, which I'm gonna, discuss later in a minute, Arthur Arendt is credited as a sole author. So he had, if you like, the right to change everything and anything. Okay. So under his direction, the Living newspaper, in my opinion, moved from a more montage to a more episodic presentation. And as he himself claims, the Living newspaper now, it has to say what has to be said, 1. 2, it has to build to the scene's own natural climax. And 3, to build to the climax of the act curtain and the resolution of the play. So for me, what this signifies is a move from satire to a dramaturgy of pathos. And a more, if you like, a less engaging interaction with the audience. Another change is that the problem or the subject, however you want to approach it, is discussed in relation to the symbolic individual character of the consumer, the little man, or Mr. Angus Button Cooper, as he appears in many Living newspapers. So instead of having a class of people, we now have the actual individual that falls very nicely within the whole idea of liberalism. That's part of the New Deal. And the voice of the Living newspaper no longer interrupts, if you like, the action or invites the audience to actively react or consider what occurs on stage. Instead, its voice becomes more paternal and instructive, thus leading to, in my opinion, a more passive reception of the events dramatized. So Power, that was the first, if you like, Living newspaper under this, accommodating these changes in form. Power dealt with the growth of electricity in America and the conflict between the private and the public ownership. The play itself begins in a very theatrical and dramatic manner. As soon as the curtain rises, there's a power cut in the theater. And the audience is faced with the voice of the loud speaker commenting on the importance of electricity. The theater manager shows up with, if you like, with 2 electricians trying to see if they can sort it out. So as the first image shows, there are small tableau moments based on actual power cuts that were mentioned in the news, in newspaper clippings. So you would have small sketches that included an operation. As you can see, they're all together. So different, spotlights would go on each scene. As soon as there was a spotlight on the operating theater. As soon as the sketch ended, you would move to the next one, the next one, the next one. Okay, all on the same, sharing the same stage. So you have the operation being performed under torches, a bakery owner calling frantically, the operator assessing losses of, his $4,000 worth of bread, a mother pleading for the heating to come on because she has a sick child, an airport radio operator, commenting how he can't land those planes safely, a theater manager saying, I can't open my theater like that, as well as a taxi driver killing a woman because it was so dark at night. Now, unlike the previous two examples that we discussed, the living newspapers, in which the action needed to be taken by social groups as well as the government, in Power, Arendt makes the case for exclusively government-sponsored energy production as the only viable solution. 1/3 of a nation, the next living newspaper, remains the most popular and commercially successful living newspaper, and it also graduated to Hollywood. So they've made a film about that, although appropriating it to, if you like, the Hollywood style. The title of the living newspaper is taken from Roosevelt's second inaugural speech. So in my way, this signifies a more full embrace of the New Deal's rhetoric, cultural and political. The living newspaper subject was housing, but its original inception that took place in the Federal Theatre Summer School, similar to what you guys are doing, in terms especially of staging, was completely different to the final play that was performed in New York. And this is the only, as you can see now, this was the only picture I was able to find in archives from that staging, if you like. So the original plan of the production used visual or projections, episodic scenes, and fragmented quotations from actual speeches and documents. Rejecting the idea of a realistic stage that would reproduce an actual tenement, a series of objects was used. And as you can see, you have pipes, rubbish bins, broken toilets, old beds. Maybe some of them are not seen very carefully, but they're all suspended above the actors' heads to stimulate the audience's imagination, but also accept the play's premises and complete the syllogism in their own minds. So the audience needs to do some work. Now, by the time the play reached New York, the stage was much more realistic. Okay, it actually reproduced an actual tenement. It was very impressive, needless to say. Okay, it's a 4-story high. It uses narrow hallways, tiny rooms, exposed pipes. They actually went out and studied how a New York tenement looked like, and they actually put that on stage. Similar to Power, 1/3 of a nation begins and ends, in this case, with a dramatic event, a fire. And this gentleman here actually is about to jump when the lights go off. Okay. Like Power, yeah, the generic character of Mr. Button Cooper that I mentioned earlier appears to be taken by the voice of the loudspeaker on a historical trip regarding the issue, regarding land and how that leads, to tenements and the housing crisis, not just in New York, but also the rest of the USA. And like Power, it comes out in favor of changes instigated only by the elected government. The government is the only one that cares about its people and the only one that can provide a solution. I'm okay for time, sorry. I just have 2 more things to say. Yeah, okay. So going back, the living newspaper made in America. Why, with a question mark? Why did I, mention that? This is how, and interestingly, it's after the end, if you like, of the Federal Theatre project, and I'll discuss that. This is how, and I'm only using Flanagan and Arendt because I used them previously. This is how they try to define the living newspaper. So the first one is a more general quote, but I think it kind of offers you a general overview of the importance of the FTP within the US and for Flanagan herself. So this is what Flanagan says: I see together with the remaking of American citizens, the making of a theater which bears unmistakably, the mark made in America. Okay. She goes on to say, although it has occasional reference to the Volksbühne, if I pronounce it well, excuse me, the blue blouses, the Bragaglia and Meyerhold and Eisenstein, the living newspaper is as American as Walt Disney, the March of Time, and the Congressional Record. And last but not least, Arendt says, I don't know where the living newspaper began. As a matter of fact, it was only a year ago that I learned there had been anything like a living newspaper before ours. But, and here's the point, I never seem to be able to locate anybody who saw one, nor have I ever seen the script of any such production. And so, while admitting the possibility of a whole avalanche of predecessors, I deny their influence, and for the balance of this article at least, that will be that. Now, this is quite ironic if you bear in mind Flanagan in 1926 traveled extensively in Europe, spent of that 1 year, 9 months in Russia, studied with Meyerhold, so productions of the Blue Blouse, actually wrote a book for the American public, a well-respected book in 1927. And Arendt worked with Joseph Losey, who had traveled to Russia, had worked with Meyerhold, brought back living newspapers texts, met with Brecht. So all these examples, or all those influences that I mentioned before, were there. So why the need to make the living newspaper made in America? So, I mean, there are different interpretations, if you like, or different ideas, but could it be because their predecessors aspired to a more revolutionary, leftist, Marxist, communist, you name it, ideological path? Could it be that the European aesthetics of commitment, of engagement, were incompatible with the new theatrical and cultural aesthetics of the New Deal? So, in my opinion, the Federal Theatre Project and the people involved in it failed to negotiate the European aesthetics of commitment within the historical context of the New Deal, which resulted in its political prosecution, okay, by the Dice Committee, and foreshadowed the most hostile reception of similar dramaturgy, whether American or European, within the realm of modernist American culture. So a theater dies, okay? If you like, there is a pun in it because the committee was run by Martin Dice, okay? So the FTP was disbanded by an act of Congress as it was, created in 1939. The main charge against it was that it was a hotbed of communism. And this view relied heavily on the living newspapers, although the latter only formed 10% of the overall FTP productions, okay? So here I propose some more reasons for you to consider or, take it further. Of all the 5 units that the FTP was comprised of, it was the only one that was headed by a woman. That to me is important, but also the only one that was headed by a woman who was of an academic background rather than artistic or theatrical exclusively. That to me shows an unwillingness to acknowledge and tolerate a narrative discourse that did not comply with that of the liberal, New Deal. Martin Dice's committee laid the emphasis on the communist inklings within the FTP, but the reality was that politicians of both spectrums and the administration in general were never keen on the creation of a federal theater. There are actual quotes of senators saying this is a waste of money. And last but not least, the FTP's federal patronage was never comfortable with its aspirations of forming a theater that was autonomous and that was willing to conduct cultural critique and social representation. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting and informative, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I hope I didn't run over.
Thank you, Rania. That was brilliant. So if anyone has any questions, I think some people are saying thank you in the chat. So.
Should I share my screen or leave it there? I'm okay.
Maybe you could unshare your screen so we could go into the gallery view, perhaps.
Okay. Stop share. Okay. All right. That worked. Yay.
So if anyone has any questions, you could either put these into the chat section or you could raise your hand. I had a very brief question just at the end related to the committee. Is the DICE committee, is this the same as the Un-American?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But I mean, most people know it as the American Activities, Committee, the HUA, but I like using it as the DICE committee because it plays nicely with the theater DICE. Yeah, and he was a Democrat in case people thought he was a Republican. So, that brings in interesting questions regarding this black and white within American politics. If you're a Democrat, that means you're more liberal or more, there's a spectrum within Democrats, so there's a spectrum within Republicans. But yes, it was the same. It would be great to know what archives to search for certain limits. So sorry.
Yeah, I have a question with regards to what has been left, what kind of material has been left. I see that there's also a question in the archive, or in the chat, which can be maybe also repeated live. But I was wondering if there's anything like recordings of more photographs, etc., that sort of gives an impression of what it actually was. No, it's very difficult to find stuff about it, except text that reflect on the phenomena.
Yes, so videos per se, it's very difficult. The only videos I was able to find of production was not of a living newspaper, was actually Orson Welles' Black Macbeth from the Negro Theatre. But can I share a link here? Is that okay? Because that can help you, I hope. So this collection, when I originally did my research, I lived in the US because there was nothing online back then. But let me see if I can find that. Did you get that link?
Yeah.
This is the local government. So this is a huge project being undertaken by the Library of Congress. So in it, they have tried. So what happens, and this is the irony about it, the Federal Theater Project, as soon as it was deemed unconstitutional, they boxed everything and just put them somewhere. They locked it up, in different parts of the country, just lock it up, forgotten. And then an academic at George Mason University, Lorraine Brown, just by accident opened up one door and found all that material and said, wait a minute, what's this? Back in the 80s. So she painstakingly then started working with those archives, and there was the George Mason, Special Collections Archives. That's what I first knew, that's where I first went. The Library of Congress also had all this material. So these are duplicates you can find. And then when it started, if you like, people started showing interest in it, they started researching the archives, or if you like, digitizing them. And of course, in San Francisco or in Michigan, you will find living newspapers performed locally. So for example, 1/3 of a nation's, and that was an interesting thing about living newspapers, the idea is that you write a script and then you can adjust it to the locality that it can be performed. So for Michigan, for example, they would use examples of housing crisis or issues they had in Michigan as opposed to the New York. So you wouldn't take the New York script and just, perform it like that in Michigan. So if you look at this link that I've sent, and I think it answers both questions by the Fabiola, I think. If you have a look, it says this collection. I've just sent you the link about the Federal Theater Project. At the top where it says this collection, you can actually choose, you can find many of the images I found. I mean, the images I had were back from, when I had to actually scan them, but now they're digital, so you can find them here. And you can find the scripts as well. Mind you, you might find one, maybe you can find different versions of the same living newspaper script, okay, depending on where it was performed. But it's a wonderful digital online archive that you'll be able to find things. I haven't went through all of it because it's huge, and I hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
So we've had quite a few questions come into the chat as well. So I can read them out, or if the individuals who've asked the questions would like to. So I think, though, I do think your link does answer a few of these questions. So AXA was asking, are there any theatre scripts of the living newspaper to read online?
Yeah, so there are some there. There is another link that is very obscure. I can email it to you once it's somewhere in my archives. That might work as well, and you can then send it. If they can't find something there, they might have it in the other one.
Okay, that sounds great. We could send a list of references afterwards, sure. Especially with the study groups happening over 3 sessions. We can keep
happy to do that.
Links and knowledge. So Kay has asked, have the living newspapers survived beyond the USA in the 1930s?
So this is interesting, because Flanagan, after the end of the living newspaper, the Federal Project, she wrote a living newspaper on the atomic bomb, which I for me, that kind of completed the journey for my research and my book. It's like, haha, this is what she did. She tried to do some before she became a director. So she was, if you like, playing with that form, but she also wrote one about, and her living newspaper coincided with Brecht's Galileo, both the American version, but also with, in Europe, in Britain actually, with McCall's the version of an issue with, so that all 3 of them, and McCall's was a living newspaper, dealt with the issue of atomic age and the responsibility of the scientists, and they all have different approaches to that. So in a way, yes. Now, whether there are new living newspapers after that, the only thing I managed to find is that any living newspaper performed was only in American universities by, if you like, amateur theatrical groups of students. Not the most recent one is, as you might have heard, the Royal Court. So I would invite you to maybe check it out, because they do say their influence, we're talking about that actually, was the American living newspaper. But to me, some of the techniques they use actually mix, if you like, the European models with the American. So, but a serious consideration of the living newspaper in terms of performance hasn't been happening for years. Systematically, and that I know of, or I've heard of people saying, if you like.
So then, thank you, Rania. We had a question from Liz, who was asking, you mentioned a specific Hollywood version of the living newspaper.
Yeah, it was 1/3 of a Nation.
Yeah.
So I saw this in the archive, so I'm not sure if you can actually, if it has been remastered or it's somewhere available online, to tell you the truth. I saw that years ago when I was researching the archives. And one interesting thing, the voice of the loudspeaker, or the voice of the living newspaper, does not exist. It's actually the building that narrates the story. So the tenement itself speaks. I think that's something interesting. You know, personalizing or dramatizing the actual building, you know. So that's how it starts. But it's loosely inspired, if you like, by 1/3 of a Nation. They put in the Hollywood spin in there.
Thank you. So we've got a few questions. I think it would be nice to run through all the questions actually, and then we go to the exercise after. And I think we might have a little bit less time. But that's okay, because the questions are all really fascinating, and I think it's worthwhile taking some time with them. Lena has asked about the connection with, or is there a parallel between the theatre of the oppressed and Augusto Boal, or Alexandre Medveshkin, the Cinetrain?
In what way? Sorry, Lena. Parallel in terms of themes, in terms of form, in terms of.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, thank you. I think yes, in form or actually approach as well, because I think giving the voice to the people who doesn't have a voice, and also like Medveshkin, I think they staged the events that just took place, and they had a train, and they filmed, and they showed, they made a screening. So it was really, I think, also the speed, how fast do you react to the events that emerge. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So yes, and you know, the film director you mentioned, sorry, I'm not going to even try to pronounce the name, I'll fail spectacularly. I think he carries on a lot from the Soviet, if you like, or Russian or European tradition of this is what's happening, and I'll move to that locality and I'll make this thing relevant to the people I'm going to show it. It's also kind of reminiscent, because I'm from, you know, I live in Scotland now, from 784, if you know the group, where they staged the Cheviot, the Stag, and the Black Oil. So they presented it in one, you know, area, and then when they moved to the next, they rewrote it to make it relevant to that. So anything to me, so there is a connection there of taking a subject that affects all people, but using it regionally and taking it with you and not being afraid to rewrite it or make it relevant to that people. For me, that's in the examples you mentioned, the importance is that the people are at the center. You know, we make theater that's relevant to the people, but we also make theater that the people can connect and comment and take it further.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Thank you. This is exactly what I was into. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you, Lina, for the question. So Ursula's question, were any of these plays staged again after the war or more recently? I think we've kind of approached this already.
Yeah, so
do you agree?
After 1939, nothing was staged, to my knowledge. And when they were staged, as I said, they were in American universities mostly. We're talking about the American Living Newspaper. And more recently, we have the Royal Courts approach. So I think they're in Living Newspaper 3 now, or 4. And we have 2 more.
Yeah, I think they're on number 3. I think the next edition begins actually in a week or so's time, so we can share that link with the group as well.
And you know, I think you can see the previous ones as well, or so they are. I mean, okay, I wrote the conclusion to my book way before this thing happened. So I say, you know, how would we revive a living newspaper today? You know, I kind of dealt with this question, kind of thinking, well, this is for me, you know, it's part of this experience, this collective experience of going to the theater. So yes, you might go on your own, or you might go with somebody else. But unlike, if you like, a film where, you know, I find this, even in movie theaters or at home, I find this a more solitary experience. I love theater because there's a bit of interaction and engagement. You can see people's reactions, even if they might not, if they're not allowed to talk. Now watching a living newspaper from a screen on my own, which I don't, you know, I mean, I try to involve my husband. My daughter's too young to see that, but yeah, it's interesting that I'm watching the first living newspaper production online.
So I was just very briefly going to go back to Shelley had a question just specifically about a living newspaper called The Strike Marches. And do you think that would be on the webpage as well that you connected us to?
You can try to. That one has a lot of the New York productions and scripts. So is that one a New York one? Because it depends, because there are so many archives that universities have nowadays, American universities, but they're not all digitized. You actually have to go physically see those, which is difficult. So it depends. If that is a newspaper that was written specifically, let's say for Oregon or San Francisco, it might be there and not on this archive, but try this archive and see if there's anything there that can, you know, connect you to something else.
Thank you, Rania. So we had a really interesting question from Anastasia.
Okay.
Anastasia, I don't know if you wanted to ask, I can read the question. So
I don't asking it.
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to hear maybe a little bit more about the participatory forms, because you said it moved from being more participatory into less as the form developed. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit on how that worked when it was a bit more participatory with the audience?
So the idea was, in the first examples, the audience, there are some techniques that you find in contemporary theater, like they would address the audience, and the audience would reply back, or they would be voting within the audience. So, back then, you wouldn't have pieces of paper. You could have like, hey, what do you think? Raise your hands, or they would be booing. The clown, or if you like, in Injunction Granted, although he was muted, but in one of the pictures I showed you, I don't know, I cannot remember, but it was the capital versus labor fighting. So the clown was in the middle, and he would say to the audience, if, obviously he was pro-labor, he would, when the capitalists were talking, he would incite the audience to do boo or out, or, they wouldn't necessarily go on stage, but they would, they would want the audience to feel free, or they didn't expect them per se, but they wanted them to express how they were feeling, or what the reaction was. It wasn't all, necessarily nice or agreed with them all the time, but they would do that. Does that make sense? So, but when you go to power on 1/3 of a nation, this is more traditional theater. Sit, listen, this is what the government will do for you, and the government will look after you. You don't need to unionize, you don't need to organize. Vote for the right government, and the right government will provide the solution. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Shall we go to Simon for his question?
Yeah, yeah, of course. I hope I can answer.
Sorry. Yeah, you've half answered it just now, actually, I think. But there's some question here about populism and effectiveness and propaganda. That's something to do with patrician generally, and the arts being patrician to an apparent general public that I'm interested in. I kind of can't quite form a question, but it's a very, very prevalent and long-standing thing in the art world, certainly, that to gain agency for one's work, you educate some nominal general public, whoever they are. And I'm always a bit suspicious of this, because that in itself seems patrician. So basically, I was just wondering whether the Un-American Activities Committee just thought it was all just commie nonsense, or whether they were more wound up by the earlier form, or more wound up by the more presumably successful later form, which you yourself say implies less interesting anyway. So in a way, it's a mess of a question, but it's something to do with populism and patrician-ness.
Yeah, well, that's, the living newspaper in itself, the American, even the more successful ones, the latter two examples, they were propaganda. They were just New Deal propaganda, and it was the propaganda that the government wanted. So it's like, go for it. I mean, Roosevelt, his wife, they went to see that. They didn't go to see the other ones, for example. Or you had administrators of the WPA and the press writing glorious remarks for that. Okay, there were some things they didn't like, but so the activity, okay, we're talking about the pre-McCarthy era. So we're talking about the 1930s, a decade in America where Marxists seemed like a viable option against capitalism, and people reading about it, playing with it, considering it, experimenting, 20s and 30s, and then moving to liberalism, which is a completely different, if you like, political system. So I don't know if I would go, with populism, like form versus, content, or, what was good, but the living newspaper, the latter ones, they were propaganda like the previous ones were. But what was interesting is that the American public, up to that point, if you couldn't afford to go and watch a play in Broadway, that was it. They had no experience of theater. And suddenly, I don't know if you want to educate it in Marxism or whatever, but they wanted to educate in a sense of, this is theater, this is for you, you know, come and see it, participate, learn what you can. I mean, they were instrumental. They were saying, this is what we believe. And some people needed to hear that. Others listening to that and saying, well, this is not for me, but I'll go and watch another one. That's why the Living Newspaper only formed 10% of the productions. You had a massive variety. I mean, we're talking just about the Living Newspaper here, but you had so many other forms of theater and productions that were taking place and were attracting even more people than the Living Newspaper, if you like. So the overarch aim of the FDP was to invite people to the theater, to tell them theater is not exclusively just for the middle class or for those that own the money, that own money. That's why their tickets were so cheap. That's why some people were able to go there without paying a ticket. And, you know, the Federal Artists Group, which was part of the WPA, you know, they were putting on performances or creating art, and they were out in the open for people to see because they were never able to go to a museum or a gallery or know what art was, you know, and that instigated the discussion. So you reach this whole, you know, your question about populism depends the perspective you're going to take on it, I feel. But it's a massive question, and it's always been there. And it has to do with patronage as well, you know?
Yes, I mean, that's my position.
Yes, and you as an artist must really experience that. So I don't know how it can be from an artist's point of view. Not must, but may.
Well, I think there's a fetish for agency in the art world, maybe all the arts. Much ink is spilled on detailing how a particular art form, you know, educates or creates the right messaging and so on. And I'm always very suspicious that has any real purchase whatsoever, except for the getting of further grants to do more, which is fine, you know, but I do find the fetishism of it troubling sometimes.
I think the main, Flanagan didn't want to educate the audience per se, that she just wanted to bring people in the theater. Because, as I said, in America, not a lot of people had that experience. So those that were excluded because of money or because the language that was presented, the issues were presented that were inaccessible, she was like, let's give them that opportunity to see theater. Theater can be part of their life. What they make with that, you know, can be a different thing or another dimension, if you like. That's why she was she didn't like Injunction Granted. She found that very pedantic. She found that very like propaganda, unionize or there's no other option sort of thing. You know, she didn't like, if you like, the language that was used.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate or anything, but I'm wondering how to bring this up to date to 2021 in the summer as an influence, because we're now in a very different, the idea of Marxism being a generally viable, popular conversation is long dead, I think. So
it is, but if you look at the themes that we have to deal nowadays, housing hasn't gone away.
Absolutely, I know.
You don't have to see it through the lens of Marxism or such an ideological, if you like, perspective, or you know, the use of space, or economics, or you know, our relationship with the environment, race. All those things are still there. It's just, you know, do you have to use the Marxist perspective? Not so. If you look, the children's theater, The Revolt of the Beavers, for example, that play deals with those issues, but from a different perspective, without using Marxism, for example. Or the Negro theater, Lysistrata, taking an old text, but how they deal with that. So, yeah. So we can talk about this further if you want.
I think also this, because Simon is the artist who's going to be contributing to the next study group I'm excited how we can develop, well, I think we can develop this conversation more as we move into Simon's in 2 weeks' time on the 10th of April. Just a very quick note on how we're running with timings, because we're having a really lively conversation. We want to carry on with the questions, and then Lisbeth and Jos and I will talk a little bit about the exercise, how it can run between the groups as at the end. So Alexandra, did you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read aloud?
I'll ask it, that's fine.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe this is sort of stretching the issue too wide. But you know, when I was listening to your presentation and then thinking how is this now existing in contemporary society, you know, American society in particular, and I made me think of any number of documentaries, you know, some with fairly wide commercial appeal that are out that use a lot of experimental forms, and in some cases, like one I know that's been out in a lot of festivals called Equal Means Equal, which is trying to get the ERA to pass, you know, and that documentary is like hand in hand with a huge, I don't know how huge, but the young women who made it have put an immense amount of effort, not just into the documentary, but into partnering with groups to actually get the legislation passed, you know, and press out about it. Except, you know, it's hand in hand with really, really active, actual lawsuits and all the rest. And so I'm just wondering, do you see a connection? Do you think the connection, because the living newspaper was sort of unknown for so long, has come through other sources, you know, like Brecht and other things like that? Or do you think that there has been some kind of continuity into more contemporary documentary film?
Well, that's tricky. I just think it's difficult because I think some of the, if that answers your question, some of the techniques that the living newspaper used through Brecht, I think because he was aware of it, but also developed it his own way, have become more, or the public or artists or filmmakers, documentary artists or playwrights have become more aware of them and were able to adapt them or take them further. Does that make sense? So I don't know how, and is your question about specifically documentaries, documentary filming, or, you know, how has, or, you know?
Well, I'm just wondering if you feel that I guess to make the question more narrow, if you feel the living newspaper was maybe through university performances and since the 80s as it's been researched, able to influence, you know, the last even say 40 years of political documentary type films, or if it was just suppressed kind of too much?
In my opinion, it was suppressed. I think people that, when I started my research, I could only find one book and a handful of articles. You know, further on, there were only a few books, and they're all interestingly written from an American perspective. I know that people in universities, because they've written theses, are more aware of it, but I don't think it has been able to transcend, if you like, to more public commercial art or documentaries, or, you know, reach a far more wider audience, if you like. So if somebody who's like a documentary artist or political activist or has come across it while studying, because I came across it by chance, like literally by chance. If you come across it, it is engaging. You do get hooked on. Then they can carry that, or they might have been able to carry that forward in their own either activism or creativity or creations, you know. But, and as I said, to the ones I've been able to study, I haven't come across somebody mentioning it as an inspiration per se. I can see traces, and this is what I've been trying to do. I've been like, you've done that, you must have read that, or you kind of, you know, you were aware, but nothing specific. But as I said, if they've come across it as students, I think they have carried it with them. Hopefully that answers a bit. Thanks.
So there's lots of questions and comments in the chat. What I'll do is I will save the chat afterwards and we can reflect back. I thought maybe I could come to Alo as she has her hand raised for the next question.
Yes, well, it's more of a comment on that. As an American who grew up with a lot of theatrical, with a lot of theater as a child and went into the arts, it's really interesting to hear about this because I've never heard about the living newspaper. It's not something that gets talked about a lot in American institutions. And I think that's, I don't know, it seems like a really interesting kind of little blip that we seem to have skipped over. And it's so interesting to be sitting here as an American listening to perhaps a more European perspective on the living newspaper. And I'm really enjoying that kind of weird dissonance, like, because I don't know anything about it. And I'm learning about it from outside of my own country. It's just really interesting.
Thank you for that. I mean, that was the...
And shall we come to Shelley also, actually? Shelley, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, in regards to what was just said, the only way I've known about the living newspaper, and I don't have a theater background, but as an American, because I've been researching about the House of Un-American Committee, and my uncle was a communist who came into the auto factories in America. So I kind of came to the living newspaper through like an article by another scholar, Jeremy Woodruff, and he was talking about the subversive sound of the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, but then he goes through the whole impact of a living newspaper and how the strikers, at the same time that they were doing the sit-down strike, were doing the living newspaper play that I mentioned earlier, the Strike Marches On. Yeah, and so I've been looking for that. But I think in that case, to me, I look at that really narrow example of that time period in living newspapers as a way to give the workers a voice to strike and to look for striking strategies that other people from other parts of the country were bringing in from living newspaper ideas. And so I kind of think it's like this feed forward feedback loop, and it's all very interesting and kind of very different than this government kind of idea of necessarily getting people to the theater. Like I think locally, it was very much about these workers are suffering, there is no union, and how can we come together and bring these ideas to people? I just wanted to say that.
I mean, that's why if you notice Flanagan's comment was that, she was eager to say, this is not a national theater the way the Europeans know it and have known, and there is a tradition there. Okay, this is a federation. So she was very, I mean, I put italics on that, but she was very keen on saying, this is a federation. So we can have like a common theme, housing, for example, but how it will develop, or the way that living newspaper or that play, or that group will deal with that, doesn't have to be the same. There's a bit of mobility, the ideas travel, and the resources can be exchanged, for theater. But she wanted to say there is a level of freedom, and there's a level of, if you like, of elasticity, plasticity, how do we negotiate this thing in Michigan or in Chicago, or the strike that was very important there. Of course they would use that couldn't transcend or translate well in a New York stage, so they might use the same thing using a different event happening there. Does that make sense? So that's why you can have the same living newspaper dealing with the same thing, but using different clippings from newspapers or articles. So
exactly,
it's very interesting to me. Thank you.
I'm going to just pop back to one of the questions in the chat, which was from Jenny Reed. And then I did notice, I think Chris had their hand up as well. But maybe Jenny, did you want to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, yes.
I was having some mic problems in another meeting. Yeah, I was curious about who decided what the subject matter of the plays was going to be and whether or not there was any kind of input other than from the writers to decide. Because I think bringing it up to 21st century, I would struggle to see something that somebody else had decided was the important issue in my town or in my area. I would almost want something else to happen first to gather the information for what was important, and then make a play out of, make a newspaper from it. So I was just curious as to the decision-making process when it came to choosing the subjects.
Yeah. So that's more complicated because then we go into the bureaucracy of the Federal Theatre Project and the living and each unit and how it's staged. So the first few years, which was more, if you like, collaborative. So people would scour, or people would sit down quite informal and say, what are the issues? So housing, trade unions, a trial, for example, with workers, for example. So that in that sense, unionism would come up. So they would try and see in newspapers, in articles, what were the main things. Then though, they had study groups going out to communities. So, there was no point putting on stage something that was completely foreign to the actual people you wanted to invite or you wanted to attract, So, for example, are you talking just about the living newspapers or generally the Federal Theatre Project?
For the living newspaper.
For the living newspaper. So, because journalists initially were involved in, they were very in touch with, journalists have their sources. So they could feel, they knew what was troubling a specific city. So, then you have 3 or 4 or 5 subjects. They would have to do research, how many clips can we find, what's more relevant, what's on the news, what are people talking about in the street? So all that would feed back, to the before the editor-in-chief, to the journalist. They would compile, this is the theme, these are the clippings, and then it would very much be a more collaborative idea of what goes first, what's more pertinent. And there are cases where something might have been decided, but then a trial happens or an event happens that takes over and people are outraged. So that would have to come first, for example. But because it's a theater and you had to create a stage, you had to rent a theater, you had to not train the actors, but there was some training involved because the high caliber actors just moved to Broadway, they wouldn't act in those plays. You had to do rehearsals, and the rehearsals, Flanagan was adamant, they have to be like a proper production. We're not just writing a play, putting it on, and that's it. There were rewritings taking place because, let's say you chose housing, the news were constantly changing. So that would have to be factored in. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, there were the journalists, I believe, that were doing the initial work, but you had to get an understanding of what the audience was affected by. And we're talking about depression, though everything was affecting them. And especially, for example, with AAA, with the farming, there was so much poverty. People couldn't buy things. There were farmers that were they were in desperate situation because, apart from the economics, the environmental conditionings in those years were awful. So even if they tried to produce something, there was no produce because of drought or, excessive rain, similar things to what we face today, So this is how it would work. So it was very much starting from the low before you go up. So Arendt, who was originally the editor-in-chief, he would, write the script based on what was given to him, but then that would be rewritten as well to make it relevant.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So thank you so much, Rania. This is brilliant. I mean, we've all got, I think we could carry on talking for a lot longer, and luckily, and the way we formulated the study groups is that we will continue this conversation through to the next study group with Simon, and which is the 10th of April, and again to the next study group, which is with Liz Magic Laser, an artist who has worked specific with the living newspaper in the past, which I can say is going to be on the 22nd of April. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to confirm that sooner. I'll put that in the chat. Lisbeth, Jos, did you have any comments or thoughts just as we're...
No, thank you all for the questions, and Rania, thank you so much for your generous and elaborate answers. And I think we could go on, I think, for another hour probably. That's also why, you know, Cicely and us were sort of texting to each other, shall we do or shall we not do the breakout rooms? But then we thought, then we really break stuff, no? So let's not break out, let's stick together and continue the questions. And I think, you know, these questions and thoughts and your answers, etc., gives us so much information, I would say, to continue and to start building at some point, and to think together how and in what ways, you know, collected energy can shape into something that is really exciting in the summer. So I'm really grateful for all this, and yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for being so part of, well, so active with your questions and interested. One of the things I thought I should highlight is that, so the summer school, we have got a date for the summer school, which you could pencil into your diaries. We think at the moment we're going to have it as a mixture, as both online and offline, based on the current COVID guidelines in the UK. So we will be able to have some elements at Hospital Field. The date that we're looking at is the 13th to the 15th of August. But we're looking at, because we've been able to do so much in an online offline capacity, we're really hoping to be able to continue that this year. And also it will be so nice to be able to have everyone here in the northeast of Scotland in our Arbroath, and even though we can't in the same way, but we have been able to bring together, I think, a much broader geographic group than we might have done before, considering that I mean, just from the, I did ask you when you were signing up to give where you were zooming in from, which has been really helpful, but also will help as we develop the study groups as we go forward, and I think bring different perspectives in that way as well. So I'm going to check that I'm not missing anything from my list of thanks, but thank you so much, Rania, and thank you so much, Lisbeth and Jos, and to everyone who's participated today. One thing I wanted to highlight is also at Hospital Field, one of the things that we're very much, we've been on site as an art school since 1901. The building itself and the site is very much based on this historic influence and founding of by artists as an artist house. We are in a really important stage of development right now. We have recently, I'm watching Lucy giggling at me, but we're about to reopen our garden, which has been redesigned based on 800 years of garden history. And we've been planting that over the summer, and we'll also be opening a fernery, which will be a hothouse of ferns, as well as a new cafe, where usually if you were here at Hospital Field, we'd not only be, this is very cheesy, nourishing you with ideas, we'd also be nourishing you with delicious food. So I hope that we can do that at some point soon. And thank you again. So we'll be in touch, and look forward to seeing you all next time on the 10th of April. And